weaker or doesn't, the impact is weaker or doesn't, isn't as consistent. And finally, because of these questions, especially the lack of, or the question about poverty, there has been questions about what's the theoretical mechanism? Why would we expect income inequality to lead to higher rates of homicide? Is it because people, it makes people angry, makes people feel deprived? And so research has increasingly tried to address what is the theoretical mechanism that connects income inequality to homicide at the cross-national level. In the literature on this, the main explanation that is given for this relationship has usually hinged on perceptions of deprivation, that most scholars studying this thought that it was potentially that people felt deprived. This caused anger, this caused frustration, this caused alienation, and these kind of negative affective states, or this anger at the system, or these kind of like perceptions of deprivation contributed to higher rates of crime and higher rates of homicide. But one of the problems for this explanation, while it might make intuitive sense, is that in the few studies that have indirectly tested this, there's been about 3 studies so far that have indirectly tested this idea. There really hasn't been any support for it, that it's questionable whether people actually know how unequal their country is versus another country. They might perceive inequality to be more acceptable in some places than others. There's not a consistent relationship between just the measure of like income inequality that you get with a Gini coefficient or a ratio of the top 10% versus the bottom 10%, that would necessarily be perceived by the general public. And so it hasn't been found, at least at this point, to be all that convincing of a mechanism. The other thing is that you'd expect from other literatures that actually income inequality or hierarchies in general come to be justified by the societies that they are in. So like income inequality over time, people justify it and say that actually it's the way that society is, and it's the way that society should be. I deserve where I am. And so instead of being frustrated or angry about a situation that is unequal, people come to justify it over time. And this has been found in both the false consciousness research that would be in more heavily in sociology, but also a psychological research on system justification theory that found that no matter what type of status it was, a lot of times people who are disadvantaged by a certain arrangement come to justify that arrangement in their head. So this perception of inequality, to me, isn't all that convincing and hasn't been all that supported within the literature. There's also the issue of why is it that it's inequality at the cross-national level that is often studied and often found to increase homicide. But when we study things at the neighborhood level, we often emphasize poverty, the concentration of poverty, economic segregation. Why is it that we are not focusing on inequality as much at the neighborhood level? So there seems to be almost like this disconnect between these two literatures. This leads to a theoretical disconnect where when in cross-national literature, we're looking at institutional anomie theory by Mesner and Rosenfeld, and we don't talk as much about social control in the sense of like collective efficacy, which is found in the neighborhood literature, primarily by Sampson and colleagues. And the idea in the cross-national literature is that like deprivation would cause crime, whereas neighborhood literature, even though there's many different perspectives, it's often emphasizing the lack of social control. So there seems to be like a disconnect between these two bodies of literature. So how do you reconcile all these problems? The thing that I thought was missing was, why is it that we aren't studying how the structure of society is impacted by income inequality? And so the structural impact can mean many different things. It's sometimes a very abstract way of talking about how society is structured, but I was thinking about the literal structure of society. The literal structure of society can be very much impacted by the distribution of income within your society. So your distribution of income can lead to neighborhoods being organized in different ways. So if your society is relatively equal, or has, you know, a low rate of income inequality. You are unlikely to have these enclaves of people who are very poor and very rich. You're more likely to have people living in mostly economically integrated neighborhoods. But as that rate of income inequality increases, you start to see more and more concentration of poverty and concentration of wealth. You start to see people from different economic and social backgrounds living in more neighborhoods that are actually homogenous rather than unequal, that they live in, you know, a neighborhood that is almost all people living in poverty. And then you have neighborhoods where everybody is, you know, the top 1%. So like you have this organization of neighborhoods that is less like unequal neighborhoods, but actually a concentration of wealth and poverty in different parts of the city. And so this is how I proposed of, you know, addressing the theoretical issues and the issue of how do you conceptualize income inequality as contributing to homicide. And I said primarily it's the big thing that it causes is residential segregation at the neighborhood level. That if you have a more unequal society, your residential segregation by income goes up, increases. And then this reduces social integration. Social integration is thought of as more being like a social control argument, but it is this idea that you are less likely to impose control on others. You also are isolated from certain like institutions that might be both the police and the economy, but you have a reduction of like this cohesive social bonds that we would conceptualize as being, you know, pro-social. And this leads to higher rates of homicide within the neighborhood level, which equals higher rates of homicide overall at the societal level. So looking at this abstract relationship here, we're now conceptualizing it as potentially taking place at the neighborhood level rather than being some sort of like abstract thing that happens only at the societal level. So looking at each one of these steps. So the first step is income inequality contributes to higher rates of economic segregation. There's been a fairly robust literature that has popped up over the last decade or so about the impact of income inequality on economic segregation at the neighborhood level. And this is probably the most, at least the most prominent example I've seen in the research on this topic was a Reardon and Bischoff paper, where they found that over time in the United States, they were looking at neighborhood concentration of income and segregation at the neighborhood level, and how that related to the increase in income inequality in the United States. And they found that overall, there was a strong, robust relationship between a growing rate of income inequality and greater rates of economic segregation at the neighborhood level. They have not been the only ones. There is part of how I actually got interested in this was there was a few studies that had found that this was also present at more and less unequal countries, that more equal countries tend to have less residential segregation, less equal countries tend to have more residential segregation. So this is the first step, is that more inequality seems to segregate neighborhoods by income. The second step is this idea that, you know, draws upon many different economic or criminological arguments about crime. And it's that residential segregation reduces social integration. This is seen within like Sampson's work on the reduction of collective efficacy, that communities that are able and willing to intervene on their own behalf are more able to control crime and disorder in those neighborhoods. There's also an isolation from economic opportunities within less socially integrated neighborhoods, that, as in, you know, neighborhoods that with concentrated poverty don't have like mainstream economic opportunities. So you see people turn to other types of alternative economic opportunities that, you know, might be criminal in nature. And then you have isolation from mainstream culture. And this is like Anderson's argument about how if people don't trust each other, don't trust the police, they might also, as I'll see on the next slide, they might also form a culture that is more looking to use self-help to resolve disputes rather than call upon, let's say, the police. So the final step, so you have increased segregation, you have decreased integration, and that reduced social integration increases homicide rates. So this is seen as Sampson's idea of less social control. You also have less cooperation with the police and the criminal justice system, and more economically segregated neighborhoods, especially at the lower end of the economic spectrum. And you have all these adaptations to social isolation. You find that people are more likely to start informal economy activities. Some of them are, nonviolent, but some of them end up like drug dealing or something where it's potential to lead to violence is fairly high. You find people are less willing to, call the police and try to resolve a dispute they might have with somebody else, and use what Donald Black calls self-help, where they're going to unilaterally solve the problem, and they're going to just, solve it in the way that they think is fit. And sometimes that way that they think is fit is a violent crime. And the Anderson's idea of the code of the streets, where you eventually have to take on kind of an aggressive posture. If you can't call the police, how do you prevent people from in your community from preying on you? You have to take kind of an aggressive posture to make sure that you aren't the constant victim. So like all these things that like you get isolated from like these mainstream institutions, isolated from the society at large, you start to see higher rates of violence because of these mechanisms within more, economically isolated communities. So looking at this evidence, there's been some research, especially in the United States, to find that economic segregation, you can see, is even more robust of a predictor than poverty concentration. That economic segregation in all these models that we're looking at, the overall homicide rate, the homicide rate among African Americans, the homicide rate among white people, all of these were associated with economic segregation. So economic segregation, or this idea that your neighborhoods are economically segregated, these are a fairly robust predictor of homicide rates at the neighborhood level. And so if we're looking at what ultimately potentially is this cause of the income inequality homicide association, it is likely that it causes neighborhoods to be socially disintegrated, isolates the poor from the rest of society.
Hey.
And there is okay. And there is a greater amount of economic and racial dissimilarity in some of these neighborhoods that are robust predictors of crime. Conversely, you find at times income inequality is sometimes predictive of higher rates of crime within neighborhoods, but it's not as robust of a predictor as things like economic segregation or poverty concentration. In some cases, you'll find that income inequality is associated with crime and homicide at the neighborhood level, but often is much more of a robust predictor at the national level. And so it's suggesting that it's not just like you kind of like a Russian nesting doll find inequality at every level of analysis to lead to higher rates of homicide. It's more that income inequality at the national level or at the aggregate level leads to racial and economic dissimilarity at the neighborhood level. And that is the contributor of homicide at the national level once you aggregate back up. So there's several implications of this perspective. It kind of resolves a lot of these issues that I was talking about, where there was critiques about not accounting for poverty. The poverty critique is largely moot here, because it's really if the causal mechanism is poverty concentration and economic segregation, then people who are talking about poverty and inequality at the national level are kind of talking about some of the same things. So it's not really a big critique in the way that I've conceptualized it here. The reason why there would be a lack of a cross or a longitudinal association is likely because economic segregation at the neighborhood level lags quite a bit behind aggregate levels of income inequality. So if society becomes more unequal next year, it's unlikely that in that same year, you're also going to have a whole bunch of more economic segregation. It likely takes a few years for that increase in income inequality to actually manifest itself in the neighborhoods. And so it will take a few years at least for an increase in income inequality to contribute to an increase in homicide. And finally, although this theoretical mechanism needs more testing, there is some indirect support that I've located a potential reason why income inequality leads to higher rates of homicide outside of just perceptions of injustice and inequality. So the overall implications here for housing and for neighborhoods is that if you have some sort of neighborhood intervention that aims to economically integrate housing, this can potentially reduce homicide rates. So if you are having these, neighborhoods that are just, economically concentrated both in the wealthy end and the poor end, it seems that homicide rates are higher. And so if you have some sort of intervention that economically integrates neighborhoods, it would reduce homicide rates within your society at large. Also, this might, increase a need for like social welfare expenditures. And this has been supported within the literature that income inequality's impact on homicide is lessened by higher rates of social welfare expenditures. And one of those ways that that expenditure can manifest itself would be to make sure that housing doesn't get too economically segregated within your society. And so there are policy implications that would say that housing, especially making sure that housing is not this project where you are putting people who are poor all living in the same neighborhood and allowing the wealthy and the upper middle class to kind of exempt themselves for the consequences of income inequality by living in different neighborhoods, that you actually want to promote economically integrated housing and neighborhoods. All right, and I think that's all I have for you. Hopefully it fit the, let me stop my share here.
It was great, Dr. Tuttle. Thank you so much for getting our conversation going around this topic. Thank you for introducing kind of the importance of reconceptualizing inequality and discussing how inequality at the neighborhood level, as well as segregation can lead to, is associated with homicides. So thank you. I know for sake of time, we're going to have each presenter go and then we'll have Q&A, but for all of us in the space, take notes, because I know I have definitely some follow-up questions from our first presenter. So thank you again. And now I'm going to move to and introduce our in the Department of City and Regional Planning at the University of Pennsylvania. So I hope it's not too cold up there, Vincent. He's an associate professor of planning and urban economics in the Department of City and Regional Planning and a faculty director of housing initiative at Penn. He is also the editor-in-chief of the journal Housing Policy Debate. His research focuses on housing policy and economics, urban economics and development, and racial discrimination and segregation. He is co-editor of the book Perspectives on Fair Housing, published by Penn Press, and has published peer-reviewed articles in peer-reviewed journals, such as the Journal of American Planning Association, JAMA Open, and the Russell Sage Foundation Journal of the Social Sciences. Dr. Vincent Renna, the floor is yours.
Cool, thank you for having me. I also can never figure out my lighting situation, so so I apologize.
You're glowing, you look great.
Thanks, that's the first time someone might have ever said that to me. I'm glowing, nice. Cool, so thank you so much for having me here today. I am going to be kind of going pretty quickly through some work, that I had done with some amazing colleagues of mine, Dr. Gina South and Dr. John McDonald at Penn. And with this, I'm going to pull in some other kind of related work that speaks to this paper here, the association between structural housing repairs for low-income homeowners and neighborhood crime. So this was the paper that was published in the Journal of American Medical Association's Open Access Journal, JAMA Open, so you can actually access that for free online, which is nice. So hopefully you find it interesting and want to read the full paper. So I'm going to throw out a lot of stats that aren't particularly new maybe to the room here, but just to kind of set the stage. Homicide is the leading cause of death for Black men aged 1 to 44. a really kind of staggering statistic that is important to start a conversation like this with, right? Gun violence has become a resurgent issue in the country since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. For example, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the location of the study, shootings increased by 40% in 2020 from the year before. The health implications of violence exposure are vast and include increased risk of depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and cardiovascular disease. People living in communities that experience spike in violence have increased hospital visits and death from stress-responsive diseases. And the root cause of violent crime in Black urban neighborhoods are structural, including past and present racist policies and practices leading to residential racial segregation, concentrated poverty, and the lack of economic opportunity. So there's a clear overlap between poverty and crime rates. This is just a map of Philadelphia itself. And what you're seeing is family and poverty and firearm violence in the city itself. What you'll notice here is there are actually little dots throughout. That's actually where Section 8 voucher households live. And the reason why I have this map here, one is because we're kind of exploring a larger project around vouchers and crime rates. But more specifically to say that that even the largest housing assistance program, the Section 8 voucher program, often doesn't enable households to access neighborhoods with lower rates of firearm violence. Neighborhoods in Philadelphia that were subjected to redlining in the first half of the 20th century are the same neighborhoods with the highest concentration of violent crime today. And so here you can see crime rates correlate with historic and current place-based investment levels, right? And so we all, I'm assuming everyone here, by virtue of coming to these hangouts and going to past ones, are familiar with redlining as a concept. Happy to come back to it later on if it needs further clarification. But one of the things I really wanted to do here is point to the reality that was pointed out by my colleague here at Penn, Amy Hillier, a while back. That, sorry, should be 2003, not 203. Is that redlining wasn't the beginning point of this disinvestment, right? In many ways, it was reflective of practices that were longstanding. The Hulk maps were a very overt example of race-based and racist investment and lending practices. But evidence by Amy Hillier and others has shown that this practice predates the Hulk maps, right? In many ways, they were formalizations of a practice that was pre-existing. One consequence of racially concentrated lack of neighborhood investment is the deterioration of neighborhoods' physical environment in majority Black neighborhoods. Housing investments have positive multiplier effects at the individual household, neighborhood, and regional level. So one of the things that I do in a book with my former advisor and now President of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, Raphael Bostic, in a chapter of our book that I edited called Perspectives on Fair Housing, is we look at kind of the economic multipliers of housing investment and disinvestment. And one thing that's very clear is those multipliers play out at multiple levels, right? They affect the individual themselves, they affect the household, but also because housing is often the largest asset that people have and the largest wealth creation tool, particularly for Black and brown households. It's often the venue through which people leverage to actually start businesses and for essentially revenue to be recycled within communities, right? And so there's clear kind of neighborhood and regional level implications of this, right? These multipliers compound over time and formalize in housing values and housing wealth. And due to historic and current discrimination in public and private investment, this has disproportionately benefited white households. As we know, when investment does happen, what often happens then is there's price pressures that can make areas unaffordable, right? And push out lower income households into areas not receiving such investments. And so it's all to say is that there's we need to acknowledge the real kind of important reality, which is that the lack of investments concerning, but also sometimes when there is the investment, it actually can lead to displacement, right? So this is at the core of the gentrification debate, right? Does gentrification cause displacement? And at the root of this is a really kind of important critical conversation about how do we actually invest in neighborhoods without then having that capitalize in home values and prices that then makes those places unaffordable and unattainable for residents who live there for a long period of time when such investments were not actually happening. So how do we actually allow residents to benefit from these investments in neighborhoods? So one of the things we wanted to do to explore this is to look in the city of Philadelphia. They developed what they call the Basic Systems Repair Program. What it was a small grant program to low-income homeowners in the city of Philadelphia. It's been going on for about 30 years now. And what it aimed to do was essentially to create grants that were given to small grants to low-income homeowners to provide basic repairs to these homes, right? So these are very basic systems. This is helping to patch a roof, right? This is helping to replace a hot water heater, right? This is meant to be things that essentially were meant to stabilize a home, right? These weren't kind of green investments and large retrofits. These were small grants just to stabilize the home itself. And they were grants, they would not need to be repaid, right? So what our study did is we wanted to actually look at this opportunity of saying, here's essentially an investment program in low-income homeowners, right, to help them maintain and remain in their homes. So what are the implications of this program on the household, on neighborhoods? And particularly in this paper, what we do is look at the relationship between these small grants and neighborhood crime levels, right? So viewing this as a real way of looking at place-based investments and the broader implications it can have across a host of metrics. And here we're looking specifically at crime. What's particularly interesting about this program is that very few of these programs actually exist, right? So there are 6 million US families living in substandard housing and very little access to grant no less loan programs to allow for home repairs, particularly for low-income homeowners who might not have access to credit due to kind of a systemic exclusion or because of the lack of actual housing values that allow them to actually pull out equity from their homes, right? To make these kind of needed investments in their homes. And so this program is unique, both in its nature, also in its scale, but also from a research perspective is a really interesting one because as the nature of many housing assistance programs, it was long oversubscribed. So what does that mean? It means that there were a lot of people waiting on the wait list for this program over time who are not being served. And over time, the program is essentially serving people off of the wait list. So this creates essentially a quasi-experimental setting, right? Because what it means is one person can apply for the program in June. The next person could apply for the month in the program in July. There's nothing functionally different about those two individuals, except for the point at which they applied. One gets a grant and one gets a grant in a year from now, the other gets a grant in 4 years from now because of the backlog. And so that creates kind of this natural treatment and control group where you get an investment on a broad set of outcomes. And here again, we focus specifically on crime outcomes. So one of the things that's clear, not surprising, is it's a program targeted towards low-income homeowners. So as a result, these grants are largely administered in economically disadvantaged census tracts. Which in Philadelphia tend to be disproportionately Black and majority Black. So the program is generally serving neighborhoods that are majority low income and economically disadvantaged and majority Black and brown. In our sample, what we do is we kind of hone in on a set of years where we have complete data to actually look at all the households who are getting the grant versus those on the wait list. And we have robust kind of neighborhood data, specifically point-specific crime data. So one of the things that's interesting in the city of Philadelphia is actually you can, through Open Data Philly, you can actually get point-specific crime data down to the block level. For the sake of this analysis, what we did is we actually cleaned the data on every household who got BSRP grant, and we matched it to the crime data on the block face level. Crime data can be imperfect on the block level, right? Because whether it happened in front of this address versus 2 addresses down, it might not be necessarily as clear, but you can feel convinced that it all happened on the same block face itself. Beyond that, you can argue clearly that any crime or exposure to violence that happens on a block essentially can be experienced on that block on the whole, right? So it's not necessarily something that just happens to or in front of that one house, but it's something experienced by the whole block and the whole block face. So what we're able to do is essentially map on nearly 14,000 households that received the intervention, some that have received it during the period of time we focused on, some that were on the wait list and eventually received it, to neighborhood crime levels, and particularly block face specific crime levels, to look at exposure to crime on the block face itself, within a radius of the crime, and at the census tract level, right? So looking at different levels of geography of exposure and impacts over time. In our sample, the mean time of people waiting on the wait list for this grant was about 2.58 years. The owners of these homes were on average about 56.5 years old, ranging from 18 to 98. They were predominantly Black, with 78.6% of our sample being Black households, or Latinx, 11.9%, and their mean monthly income was $993. And so what we did is we used the difference in differences Poisson regression model to estimate the association between BSRP with block level crimes, right? Again, we have a treatment and control group. What a difference in difference does is essentially looks at one group before and after the grant and compares them to the control group, right? So you have your differences of the one group pre and post the grant, and then you have their difference relative to the group that did not receive the grant. So again, we know the group that did not receive the grant eventually receives the grant, but their only difference is that they signed up to receive the grant slightly later than the first group who actually received it, right? Which creates a really powerful quasi-experimental setting to study this. So what we find is the addition to a block face of a property with a BSRP intervention was associated with a 21.9% decrease in the expected count of total crime, a 19% decrease in assaults, a 22.6% decrease in robberies, and a 21.9% decrease in homicide. So although these estimates were large in magnitude, the mean count of crimes per quarter was relatively low, 0.884 per quarter. So this count essentially translates to 5.6 fewer crimes in total over 29 quarters from the addition of a property with a BSRP investment. One of the things that's really interesting too is what we wanted to do is not just look at kind of the presence of an investment versus the lack of an investment on a block face, but we also wanted to look at a potential dose effect, right? Does more houses receiving this grant actually reduce crime in addition to each other, right? What is the marginal essentially benefit of every additional grant? And what you see is essentially a dose effect where essentially up till you get to about 4 or 5 crimes, you see every additional home getting a grant actually reduces crime levels, and then it essentially levels off, right? So what this shows is an importance of scaling this program, but it also really shows the fact that this program isn't necessarily a panacea, right? We can't use a place-based housing grant investment program as the thing that essentially eliminates crime, right? It's one of the many multiple factors we should be considering as we look at crime reduction and the broader need for investment in promoting the reduction in crime. So as the previous speaker already mentioned, right, there's a lot of mechanisms that could be in place here: improve physical environment and social connectedness, increase strength of relational community connections, perceived benefits of collective efficacy, reduce housing stress and improved health, improve mental health, increases in other investments, or multiplier effects of these investments, right, that could be driving these. But one thing that's very clear is that, you know, this presence of this investment is very clearly associated with the reduction in crime levels, right? So this is a really positive study that I think contributes to the really kind of broad set of framing of the need for place-based investments, right? But I want to really kind of step back and say we need to acknowledge that these place-based investments should be considered in the context of broader structural improvements made to neighborhoods, investments in neighborhoods, but also, you know, the reality that sometimes these investments can come with concomitant increases in prices and rents. And so you want to make these investments without necessarily, you know, pushing out existing residents and making the neighborhoods that have reductions in crime become inaccessible to lower income households over time, right? So I want to kind of take a step away from the place-based investments a little bit and just kind of plug one last thing that's separate, but is very much in the housing realm, is, you know, we really need to think more broadly about the long-term connection between housing and health and the lack of both housing investment and safety nets in place in our country, right? That is very clear during the COVID-19 pandemic. I know that's come up in a couple other housing hangouts before. So I'm going to kind of be breaking from topic here a little bit. But I think it's a really kind of important critical connection. As we think of place-based investments, we also just have to think of broader housing investments and a broader safety net around housing, right? And one thing I want to highlight as my last point is we recently released an interactive report. You can access it through our website, the links at the bottom there, kind of estimating the demand for the Section 8 voucher program across the country. One of the most defining characteristics of our largest housing assistance program in this country is essentially its undersupply, right? There are as many as 5 households eligible for every one who's currently receiving and using a voucher in our country, right? And what this means is that we've essentially created this form of violence on low-income households where we ask them to apply for assistance and wait for a long period of time for supports they might not ever get. And even once they get it, they might not actually be able to use it, right? My own research shows that 48% of households who are actually income eligible and offered a voucher are not able to actually use the voucher they're offered for a whole host of reasons. This disproportionately affects households headed by Black-headed households, elderly-headed households, and households with kids who already, we know, systemically face barriers in housing markets more broadly, right? So as we think of these place-based investments, we also have to think very critically about these kind of broader safety nets in place around housing, right? And promoting housing stability and acknowledging that they don't exist in our country, right? And that we really need to kind of view all of these things as really integral pieces that are interrelated for a more comprehensive approach of viewing these connections between housing health and housing and the reduction of exposure to gun violence. So I'll stop there.
That was great. Thank you so much for that presentation. Thank you also for the statistics that you included that really provided additional context and background on this issue, as well as also illustrating who is most likely to be impacted by both housing and violence issues as well. And thank you for giving an example of a promising intervention that could address both. I will now turn our attention to our third presenter, Dr. Christina Plaherples. Stacy, please correct me with that.
You can skip. That's my maiden name. You don't even need to say it.
Dr. Stacy, who is a senior principal research associate in the Metropolitan Housing and Community Policy Center, where she specializes in urban economics, equity, and inclusion. Her work focuses on the intersection of economics and urban spaces and how housing, transportation, local economies, health, and crime interact. Stacy is currently studying whether exclusionary zoning and rent control increase the supply of affordable housing and access to opportunities for families with low incomes and people of color, and evaluating Houston's Endowment's Racial Equity Initiative. She is also leading a randomized controlled trial of an unconditional and conditional cash transfer program coupled with job training aimed at reducing youth violence and the evaluation of the Boys and Girls Club of Puerto Rico's two-generation model that builds family well-being by working with children and the adults in their lives together. Woo. And last but not least, she is also working with cities across the country to help ensure the federal economic recovery funds are used in a way that promotes an inclusive and equitable recovery from COVID-19. Dr. Stacy, thank you so much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Having me. Sorry, I should have given you a shorter bio. It's quite long. Pull up my presentation. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here. Also great that the first two presenters covered a lot of the topics that I was going to cover, so I can breeze through those. Thank you so much. I'll probably just be reiterating a lot of what they said and giving some examples of our studies that support a lot of the theories that have already been, theories and evidence that have already been talked about. Sorry, my Alexa is talking in the background. I must have said something close to Alexa. So this high level question. So how are housing, neighborhoods, crime, and health related? And to your original question, Erica, can we address the public health issue of violence by addressing both housing and neighborhood conditions? I'm sure everyone believes by now after our first two presenters and from other work that I'm sure you've seen, but my spoiler is I absolutely 100% believe that it can, and that we need to address we need to make sure that everyone has access to safe, affordable housing in high opportunity neighborhoods in order to address crime and health. So just a few of the high level areas or reasons why I and others at Urban Institute believe this. So access to safe, affordable housing in high opportunity neighborhoods is absolutely a prerequisite for upward economic mobility. And then this in turn leads to lower rates of crime. If you believe in the rational choice theory of crime, where people choose to commit crimes based on the rational cost trade-off of the expected cost versus the expected benefits.
I do.
Oh, sorry. Was that a question? Or I think maybe just a unmuted line. Okay, keep going. Then it would be logical to assume that as you help people move up economically up the ladder, then their opportunity cost of committing a crime become higher and they're less likely to commit it. So we also know, as we've heard from the other two presenters, that concentrated poverty, another route through which housing neighborhoods, crime and health are related, is that concentrated poverty is associated with elevated rates of crime. And so desegregating neighborhoods is also key to reducing crime. A great example of this is Ala Prentice and Hartley's 2015 paper, Blowing It Up and Knocking It Down, which shows that when in Chicago, when the high-rise public housing demolitions were torn down and residents were spread out throughout the city, more crime was reduced. So just one great example of that. And we also know that low neighborhood quality can lead to increases in crime rates caused by general disorder, another topic that we've heard a couple of times throughout today. And the last study really, potentially that could be one of the mechanisms through which the last study was finding its effects. And then finally, certain types of commercial activity in residential neighborhoods. So it's getting a little bit out of housing, but more into neighborhoods. We know that commercial activity can be associated with changes in crimes, sometimes in good ways and sometimes in bad ways. So investing in underinvested neighborhoods and providing job opportunities can be a good thing for crime in the long run, reducing crime in the long run. But other types of commercial activities, such as liquor stores, have been shown to be associated with elevated rates of crime. So thinking about all of these pieces holistically about how where we live, our homes, our neighborhoods, what opportunities we have near where we live, how many jobs and parks and everything else we can get to really affects our health in the long run and also affects rates of crime. So I'm just gonna really quickly, much higher level than might be needed. So feel free to ask any questions, talk about two studies that we've done that are related to this. The first is one I did a long time ago, so forgive me for my misremembering of any of that or not having the details top of mind. It was actually my dissertation, but I'm going to talk about a study we did looking at vacant building demolitions and crime in Saginaw, Michigan. So vacant buildings have been shown to be associated with elevated rates of violent crime, and substandard housing has been shown to contribute to disorder that can also encourage crime. So to explore this issue and to think about, to see whether demolishing vacant buildings can negate this. And even if we do have a solid set of evidence that says when properties become vacant, crime increases, that doesn't necessarily mean that demolishing them is going to negate that. There are many reasons why it could or couldn't. So we really wanted to study this directly and see whether it works, since so much money is invested in vacant building demolitions. So I collected data painstakingly from the basement of City Hall in Saginaw on vacant building demolitions and estimate the effect of demolitions on single family homes on crime in the city. Use a Poisson fixed effects random trend model, which accounts for both differences between Black groups that don't change over time, but then also accounts for any pre-trends that may exist. So if demolitions are occurring in neighborhoods that are worsening or improving, if the city is selectively choosing, which they really weren't, but if they were somehow selectively choosing where to demolish based on those pre-trends, this would account for that. And then secondly, I compare crime after the demolition to crime before the permit is issued, because some of the qualitative research I did while I was there, I learned that just the fact of putting up the sticker that the demolition is pending on that house can cause increases in crime because it's a signal to people that the house is vacant. And so anecdotally, officers had often seen increases in crime after the permit went up. So we don't want to compare crime after the demolition to right before, because there might have been elevated rates due to the permit. We also look at, I keep saying this is the last study I did on my own before coming to Urban, so I'm not used to saying I, but I also analyzed the displacement and spillover effects of demolitions and permits through a spatially lagged independent variable model. So looking at this effect over space. So what effect does it have on the block group in question, but then on nearby block groups, just to make sure there aren't any weird displacement or spillover effects happening. So long story short, I'm going to skip all of the middle part and go right to the findings. So I did find that demolitions are associated with reductions in crime with or without controlling for the permitting period, interestingly enough. So when permits are included, as well as these fixed effects at both the block group and trend level, one demolition is associated with a reduction of 7.5% of crimes per month per block group, or about 9 crimes per year. And for violent crime, one demolition reduces violent crime by about 2 crimes per year on average. If we look at this over time, you can see that most of this effect is on property crime, and it's about 3 months after the demolition. So just interesting trends over time as well. And we don't see like any significant pre-trends, which is good. So just skipping quickly to another study to give another example. More recently, I worked with the city of Baltimore and some researchers at Johns Hopkins University School of Public Health to analyze a zoning rewrite in Baltimore that affected liquor stores. So just to give a bit of background on stepping back to what even is zoning, because a lot of people, this isn't something many people think about it as much as I do or others at Urban do. But zoning is the process of dividing land in a municipality into distinct districts. Uses are permitted or prohibited. And it's a tool traditionally used to guide urban growth and development. However, it's also been used to address public health and health equity. And I think, there's a lot of potential for us to use it even further to, let's talk about the history of racist policy and planning, which has already been brought up, to negate some of that. And just on a side note there, I'd highly recommend people read The Color of Law, which details in excruciatingly painful detail our history of direct racist policies that led to our segregated communities that we see today, intentionally racist policies. But anyway, zoning now, I firmly believe we should be fixing it to make up for those past indiscretions. So some examples of how it's being used today to address public health are to close fast food restaurants, to incentivize urban agriculture and farmers markets to promote access to healthy foods, and incentivizing grocery stores to locate in under-resourced food deserts. In this case, what happened was the professors that I work with at Hopkins, they had done a health impact assessment of Baltimore's overall zoning structure before this change. And one of the recommendations that they made was that they address the liquor stores that are located in residential neighborhoods. So these are little kind of small liquor corner stores with, apartments over and next to it. We went and visited one, and I actually got solicited to buy drugs. And right next to it, there was like a kid playing on his little scooter. So just to paint a picture of like what these types of liquor stores are there. But then there are some that were seen by the community as a community central meeting point, and that were very seen as valuable to the community. So there was variation in what how the communities in each of these neighborhoods felt about the liquor stores, but some of them were certainly just anecdotally seemed to be places I wouldn't necessarily want my child riding their scooter around. So so the city, as part of their zoning rewrite, for 76 liquor stores in residential areas to relocate, close, or convert to an improved use, which is sell fresh fruits and vegetables, sell other things. And so we wanted to evaluate this, and the city wanted us to help them evaluate how is this working, how might this work? Because when we were hired to do this, the stores hadn't closed yet, so we couldn't actually look at the impact of the closures, but they wanted us to start to help them think about evaluating it. So to do so, we did a mixed methods analysis. We conducted interviews and focus groups with residents, city leaders, other people, store owners who obviously weren't happy about it. We conducted a baseline analysis of the affected stores to identify comparison neighborhoods so that the city could monitor this in an ongoing fashion. And then just to try to get a sense of, will this even help? Is this going to help? We looked at, we estimated the impact of previous closures and openings of liquor stores on neighborhood crime using a similar model from before, the spatial Poisson random trends fixed effects. So we found that previous liquor store closures were associated with crime. For every liquor store closing, violent crimes declined by 1.4% or 0.19 crimes per year on average, so quite small, but there was an effect. And for every liquor store opening, violent crimes increased by 1.1% per year, or 0.15 crimes on average. We didn't find any negative impacts of closures on nearby neighborhoods, though there were negative impacts of openings on nearby neighborhoods. And so overall, I'll say though that some of the event studies that we did where we look at that effect over time could imply that there might have been an Ashenfelter spike happening where we did our best to remove any liquor stores that were closed due to the riots in Baltimore. A lot of stores closed around the time because that's clearly associated with crime and there would be all sorts of problems with that. But there still might be others that closed due to recent crime. And so that would be clearly an endogeneity issue. And if that happened, then we might just be seeing a reversion to the mean when we see that reduction in crime. So we strongly encourage the city. After this, we said that this indicates there could be a potentially positive effect, but we encourage people to evaluate this moving forward. And so if no one's done this, this is a great thesis idea or something if somebody wants to study it. And additionally, prior closings might be quite different from these forced closures, and the forced closures are more exogenous, so they'd be get you closer to causality. Okay, and then I just want to mention really briefly a few other related studies that we're doing or have done that I think can help just highlight this connection between housing, neighborhoods, health, and crime. We've done a health impact assessment of housing code enforcement on health, including crime, in Memphis, and we're currently doing one in Philadelphia. So what we're doing is looking at the ways in which housing code enforcement, which is the system of agencies and laws and procedures that cities use to help enforce housing codes, help keep, lead paint out of houses and pipes, and keep, force landlords to fix roofs so that, kids aren't getting rain and mold and asthma in the house. So we looked at in Memphis, and we're currently looking in Philadelphia at the ways that the system can more directly target and improve public health, because code enforcement has more traditionally been used to address immediate health and fire hazards, rather than we think it has the potential to do so much more and to really address some long-term health inequities. We're looking at the impacts of we have looked at the impacts of economic activity on crime and on gunshots in particular. So a few studies looking at that. I'm currently running, as Erica mentioned, a randomized control trial of a cash transfer to youth at risk of committing gun violence. And one of the things we're going to be looking at is whether the kids spend this money. It's $150 a week for 13 to 17-year-old boys, whether they spend any of that on rent or whether their housing security changes because of that. And so trying to tease out some of those relationships there. We're evaluating the impacts of rent control and inclusionary zoning on the supply of affordable housing and access to opportunity. Another mechanism through which you can potentially improve housing affordability and housing affordability, I'm blanking on the other word right now, but to address the core roots of crime. We're evaluating the impacts of affordable housing on nearby property values with, our most recent findings show for the city that we're looking at that affordable housing units are actually associated with an increase in nearby property values, which would suggest that they would not be associated with an increase in crime, right? Because you'd probably see a reduction in property values. So these things can all be related. And then we have evaluated various homeownership support programs like shared equity and financial coaching on a variety of outcomes. So in sum, I think, I firmly, strongly believe and have built my career and life around, the belief that housing is just absolutely integral to creating safe, healthy neighborhoods. Planning, zoning, code enforcement, and other housing and land use interventions are necessary for creating safe, healthy houses and neighborhoods. And housing and neighborhood improvements can lead to a host of other benefits beyond crime reductions, like reductions in asthma, mental health problems, developmental delays, heart disease, behavioral and learning problems, and physical injury. And while reducing crime calls for policies and programs at all levels of government and across many agencies, sectors, and disciplines, increasing access to safe, affordable housing in high opportunity neighborhoods is critical to achieving this goal. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Stacy. Thank you for your presentation and highlighting, especially the two studies around the demolition of buildings, vacant buildings, as well as the analysis of liquor stores and their closures. I also really appreciate how every presenter thus far has really highlighted the environmental factors, as well as the structural factors and barriers that contribute to these inequities, and how the interventions that are being discussed are intervening around these environmental and structural factors instead of just focusing on the individual level, for example. So thank you, Dr. Stacy, for your presentation. Our last presentation is from our panelist, Catherine Johnson, who's going to round out our discussion and bring into the conversation family violence, where we've previously talked about homicides and gun violence. And now we're going to talk about the relationship between housing and violence as it relates to the family unit. So Catherine Johnson is the first director of the Guilford County Family Justice Center. So she's also here locally. She's the director for the Guilford County Family Justice Center, a public safety initiative through Guilford County designed to bring professionals together under one roof to provide coordinated collaborative services to victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, child maltreatment, and elder abuse. Catherine is a licensed marriage and family therapist in North Carolina and received her master's degree from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. Under her leadership, the Family Justice Center has served over 50,000 individuals since opening in June 2015 and has expanded to include 2 locations. In addition, Guilford County has been recognized at the local and national level for its successful collaborative efforts. Catherine has been awarded the Outstanding Practitioner of the Year Award for North Carolina Association of Marriage and Family Therapists, Early Career Award from UNCG School of Education, Outstanding Women in Business Award from the Triad Business Journal, and in 2016 was named the Greensboro News and Records Rising Star. We are so happy to have a rising star with us, a star. Catherine Johnson, thank you for your presentation and the floor is yours.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. My strategy today is going to be a little different from my colleagues that went before me. So give me just a second. All right. So what I'm going to talk a little bit about is Guilford County's strategy, this kind of multi-directional, multi-agency strategy of working with victims of domestic violence, sexual violence, child abuse, elder abuse, and stalking. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more about the intersections of domestic violence and homelessness, because there are certainly some intersections. And some of these things I'll share are national level statistics and things that happen at the national level, but very much I chose strategically statistics and details that really correlate to the work that we are doing each and every day here in Guilford County. So in Guilford County, and now just because I know there's lots of Guilford County folks on this call, I just want to kind of give a little context for what the Family Justice Center is, and then I'll tie that into DV and homelessness. But here in our community in 2013 and 2014, Guilford County led the state with the most number of domestic violence homicides. That meant more people were being killed here in our county than anywhere else in the state of North Carolina. When statistics like that start to happen, you start to get some buzz with elected officials and agency heads. And we did a lot of work with A&T and UNCG and stakeholder surveys and really trying to see what some of the biggest challenges were in our community and doing some fatality reviews to kind of make some connections of why people were being killed and why over half of all of our homicides were domestic in nature. And just to give some statistical perspective, in most communities, domestic violence homicides are less than 10% of all homicides. So when you have over 50% of your homicides associated with domestic violence. And when we started kind of looking back through some of those fatality reviews, we saw a lot of connection points where survivors were showing up to get the help that they needed, but they were kind of being forced to go to all these different places. So systematically, we were blaming them for not following through or not doing what they needed to do, but we were making it so challenging to access resources. And most people in a crisis, regardless of how much money they have, are going to show up at one place and they're going to, that's their one and done. And so we knew that we had to make a better one and done so that individuals and families in our community could come to one place and access a lot of different resources. So our services were really splintered, difficult to access. And so we knew the systems change was really essential to moving the needle in our community for how we were addressing violence and abuse. And that strategy was multi-directional. So we were looking at victim safety and response, but also in offender accountability, and really looking at where were those big systems gaps that were communicating to survivors or putting more and more burdens on survivors for how they were accessing health and safety resources. So when we brought together a lot of different organizations from throughout the county, different groups from elected officials to local law enforcement to heads of area nonprofits, grassroots oriented agencies who are working kind of mostly with marginalized communities, and different leaders from throughout the community who were kind of giving voice to why people were falling through the gaps, or also looking at where were survivors going when they had an emergency. And, you know, some people call 911, some people show up at their neighbor's house, some people tell it to their faith community, some people are going to the courthouse, or some people are arrested, and through that process of being arrested, disclose the need for help. So we knew that there was these folks were going all over town. So all of these agency decision makers who were already spending the money in some capacity to address the problem sat around the same table week after week after week and talked about how they could coordinate and really connect the resources in a much more strategic way. Our community made the choice to go with the Family Justice Center model, which started out in San Diego in the late 1980s. And there's probably about 150 Family Justice Centers nationwide. North Carolina has 3 that are affiliated with the National Family Justice Center Alliance, but that really national work is really focused on multi-agency collaborations that are really at the intersections of big systems like the criminal justice system, the victim advocacy social support system, the county government systems of social services, the law enforcement interventions, and the civil legal process, which are major systems that respond when there's an emergency around domestic or sexual violence. So what we're really striving for is when we think about collaboration and we hear that word, gosh, I feel like that word is like on the tip of everybody's tongue. We have to collaborate. We have to collaborate. Most people, or at least I can speak for myself, I used to collaborate like this. So I'm going to show you my drawer of business cards, and I would go into a meeting, which I haven't been to in forever. I would get someone's business card and open this drawer right here, stick it in there. And, you know, we were collaborating, AKA networking. I was getting your information. You were getting my information. Every once in a while, I may work with somebody and say, I think I knew somebody who did that. Let me look through that card. But the truth is, this drawer is just collecting dust. I'm just going to be honest. And I know some really awesome people whose information's in that. But if we think about that spectrum of collaboration, what we're really working toward through the Family Justice Center model, and I really believe is part of our solutions around addressing the intersections of violence and abuse and homelessness, is really thinking about collaboration at a much further level where we're not only exchanging information, but we're working in harmony, we're sharing resources, and our ultimate goal is to make our partner at their best so we can be at our best. And that is really complicated. We know that most systems exist in isolation. They're siloed naturally. It is a lot easier to work in the same building with people who think like you, who work for you, and you pay their salary. We get a different level of deliverable when someone is employed by us versus when we're bringing in this multi-directional strategy of all of these different organizations and saying, hey, we're going to get on the same page. We're going to move in the same direction. I'm going to challenge you when you're making choices that maybe impact me or the person we're helping, but I'm also going to support you if I have a resource, even if it's a personal resource, to help you get where we need to go together. And we say here at the Family Justice Center all the time, we're only as strong as our partner who's struggling the most. Because we know systematically when a survivor comes in, how they interface. It doesn't matter if it's the admin person, the legal attorney, the police officer, or the victim advocate. When they walk out the door, they're going to say the Family Justice Center, ... So we're really looking at moving out of this kind of business card pass around experience. And I think what's also significant about that, my slides really like the business card picture, is what's most also significant about that is that I think what happens, and we see this in systems of care all the time, is that we're moving people from one place to the next, or they're showing up at a place, there's this huge brochure wall, and we're paper terrorizing them. We're terrorizing them with all of these resources. And we really believe in our work that a relationship-based strategy, not only with the person we're helping, but also with the resources that we're working with. And so after I came to work for Guilford County, and prior to coming here, I was the director of a domestic violence shelter. I started a federal transitional housing program working with survivors, and did a lot around housing related things in Davidson County. And I used to refer survivors to places all the time. I would say, oh yeah, you should go down there to medical ministries because you can get free medical help, or you could go to XYZ food pantry, or you could go blah, 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 blah. But what I realized is the connection point and execution really drops because I didn't know anybody that worked there. And even if I knew somebody that worked there, I had never been there. And so part of the messaging that I often share when I talk about collaboration is it has to be rooted in relationship. So I never refer anyone anymore, and no one that works for me, and I have quite a big team, we refer to no one unless we've actually been there, because I want to know if the admin person's nice and going to treat that person with respect. I want to know if you walk in the door, you're going to be sitting on a couch from 50 years ago, donated from somebody's grandma's house who died, or if you're going to be treated like you are being treated with kindness and hospitality. So that really has been a shift. And I think it's helped to connect a lot of dots around helping people get the support and services that they need. As a result of Guilford County's collaboration, we've seen some big systems change. One of the most significant pre-COVID is the domestic violence homicide rate in our county dropped almost 90%. And that was during a time when homicide rates were at record highs. So we dropped the domestic violence homicide rate went far below 5%, which was a great marker. We've added all kinds of new resources because when multi-agencies, multi-directional strategies say, we need to add this resource because this is a resource need amongst multiple agencies. We're hearing these themes amongst survivors and families. So we've just been able to do some innovative things like add a full legal clinic from Elon Law or a medical clinic from Cone Health. These were things that did not exist. And while an individual or an agency in isolation maybe would say, we really need an attorney around here for that, or we really wish we had a specialized medical provider, we were really strategic in bringing those parties together and saying, let's make it happen. Let's write grants together. Let's problem solve together. Let's put our stats together. And we really started telling a different narrative in Guilford County. And as a result, that hundreds of thousands, if not millions of new dollars of resources have been infused in our community due to that collaborative. Many people don't collaborate for ego and for money. They think they're going to lose their money and they're going to lose their identity. And that gets in the way of doing the right thing all the time. And so what I say to people who come up with all the reasons why they can't do it is I say that old adage, liar, liar, pants on fire. If you're in it to help people, then you'll put that crap aside and make the right choice. But it's always easier said than done. We have seen new challenges working with survivors and really thinking through like long-term needs. So much of the work around violence and abuse has really been hyper-focused on this emergency crisis period and not long-term solutions. And so during COVID, we've really been able to accentuate some of those challenges in our community. And these are challenges across the country that we've seen around violence and abuse, is really lacking long-term services, which is keeping people in a rapid cycle of crises. Major gaps in the criminal justice system. And we know and believe in criminal justice system reform and bail and bond reform and lots of discussions around that. But if you're a survivor, you call 911, your abuser is arrested, you lose your housing, and then they're let out the next day with a written promise not to do it again. You have multiple systems just telling you what you reported and what you need is not validated. And that we've seen that happen more and more with this kind of emptying out the jail strategy during COVID, the number of survivors coming back and saying, why did I reach out for help? Why did I go through these steps? We're re-victimizing them at not only the individual level, but at the systems level. Other COVID challenges, and we've been open every day, and many of our partners stayed fully in it, in-person care, is just a dramatic burnout and turnover amongst helpers. And that is dramatically increasing safety risk. When the person you're working with has only 2 weeks of on-the-job training and you get thrown into someone's major big T trauma, and we expect those professionals to deliver high quality services, I mean, it just is not realistic. And then it's really been highlighted over the past couple of year plus months is just the community's low level understanding of their role in solving these systems issues. They see it as like, oh, that's a such and such problem, and it's really externalized and not realizing how this impacts the overall economic health of our community. When we think about some of those intersections of violence and abuse, we know that, and stats say this, and report after report after report talk about the intersections of domestic violence and sexual assault being leading causes of homelessness for women, children, families, and LGBTQ individuals. Due to long-term housing solutions, people stay trapped. And then the systems level solutions, as I already shared, just rarely go beyond an emergency response. And we see that a lot in domestic violence shelter services. So part of that, how agencies, when they're overwhelmed and stressed, start putting in rules. That's how we manage capacity, is can we make enough rules that we can screen people out? And one of the trends we've seen even in the domestic violence housing movement is, are you homeless or are you fleeing domestic violence? And so we're putting survivors in this, well, am I this or am I that or am I both? And that the screening mechanisms around emergency shelter in many ways have become almost impossible to meet. And we know that so many survivors are experiencing both. They may be homeless first, but that homelessness could have resulted from domestic violence, or they may be homeless and experiencing domestic violence. So this idea of, we have this conception that victims of abuse are fleeing during the middle of the night, and that is just not reality. Many people are pushed to this breaking point and then in need of resources, but they're getting screened out. We also know that when we look at some of those stats, 80% of homeless women with children are reporting domestic violence. 84% of residents are saying shelter residents need help with affordable housing. We know those solutions are incredibly limited. And then for survivors in shelter, if we exacerbate poverty, their trauma history, we're putting them in this downward spiral. And we know that when you have those things, compounded stress after compounded stress, and you're carrying it from generation to generation, then you're not the ideal candidate, right? We have these expectations of folks. Frankly, when I was in shelter services in Davidson County, we had a 6-page rule book for survivors living in our shelter services. And we wondered why we had so much conflict between staff and residents. And it was, we were creating these ridiculous rules, like what time their bed had to be made and when they had to feed their kid. I mean, literally, that's how some of these housing systems have been set up in the past. And those were just creating these conflicts versus we took that rule book, we threw it out the door and said 3 rules. You can't abuse substances in the center. Now, if you need to abuse substances to survive your situation, go for it. You just can't do it here. No weapons and no violence between residents. And really, when we lowered the rules, we began to be able to be in relationship, but we just see a lot of challenges. And we know people under that amount of stress are not going to be the quote unquote ideal candidate, because what is that anyway? And then many homeless women report that domestic violence is an immediate cause. And I would say that domestic violence is much of a mainstream terminology, that what we see in our work here at the Family Justice Center and serving 50,000 individuals in the past 6 years is many people report domestic violence, but they really have a history of polyvictimization. They've been victimized multiple times over and over again throughout their lifetime, but it's safest to check the domestic violence box because that's the box we talk about most often. Most survivors aren't going to come in and say, well, yeah, in addition to this, this, and this, and I'll check sexual assault and I'll check all these other things. So we know that sexual violence also plays a critical role in housing challenges that survivors face. Whoops. So some of those barriers that we see is obviously the lack of housing and the lack of long-term solutions and housing affordability for survivors. If they have gaps in or a loss of employment, it can be very challenging. We look at the systems of filing for a restraining order or going to criminal court, and with the delays in the court system and the criminal justice system due to COVID, you may be called to court 6, 7, 8, 15 times before your case is remedied. Well, 15 times of needing to leave your job, that letter of I have to go to court is only going to last so long. And so survivors are in these, they're bartering for their family safety, they're bartering for their job. And we see that rapid cycle, financial exploitation, a poor credit history, Survivors often talk about being denied admission into housing or being in situations where there are these crime-free ordinances. So you're penalized if you call the police to help you, which we know really creates safety risk for folks who are living in homes where they don't feel safe. And that sense of property damage or reports to law enforcement become a consequence. And while many survivors don't want to leave their abusive partner, they dial 911 because they need to have what's happening in that moment to stop. But when they do that and they're kicked out of their housing or their housing is in question, then it may prevent them from reaching out for emergency resources. And then the last barrier that I'll mention is that housing professionals just lack a real understanding of DV and trauma. And so we've really segregated these. We've segregated DV, we've segregated the housing problems, we've segregated elder abuse, and this need to really merge these into multi-directional solutions and looking at things not as silos, but as a complex single solution moving forward. There are some legal protections that have happened to help survivors, the Fair Housing Act, the Violence Against Women Act, and North Carolina landlord tenants. There are some tools that can certainly help survivors. We know that these protections, where we see this coming into play is if the survivor's getting ready to lose their housing, or if they file a restraining order, need to get out of their lease, or they're involved in a criminal matter and need to terminate their lease early, there are some protections for that, and there are some civil legal services for that. But again, these are, hard to navigate, and there's just not enough of that resource to go around for the magnitude of the problem. So when we think solutions, and big picture solutions is what we think about over here at the Family Justice Center, is we know a couple of things: that there's not enough resource, but really also that there's not enough standards for evaluating how some of these programs are funded and what their outcomes are. And in general, in the DVSA work, which I've been in for 15 years, we don't do the best job with outcomes because it's hard to follow survivors over a long period of time, which is one of the, and people want, the nitty gritty details of, well, did they leave their abuser and are they happily ever after? And I'm like, well, let's talk about complex relationships and the history of those relationships over time. We also see that just cross-training and intentional collaboration. If I go back to that image of business cards, that's where a lot of us sit in mitigating some of the community-based challenges. So really looking at broad level solutions that are multi-directional, that are supporting long-term care and long-term healing, kind of moving that needle beyond the crisis. And then working toward the community's understanding of the complexities of these challenges, many of them that have been shared by those folks who spoke before me at the both national statistical level, but also, the whole thing Tina talked about with the liquor stores and the intersections of all those things. We know that it's a full community issue that we've just really looked at as someone else's problem. And so helping folks see what their role is in that solution. I do have this picture on the bottom, as I just appreciate this opportunity. I know we're going to do some Q&A, but I think collaboration is like running a marathon, and I've done a couple of those, and I think it's because my job may make me a little off the chain, and I also think it's a way for me to stay on the chain. But just like a marathon, collaboration, slow and steady work. It's not a short sprint. You kind of got to be in it for the long haul. And I think that so often, survivors tell me all the time, and I have the opportunity, I coordinate a couple state and national level survivor groups. And they talk about, obviously walking into an agency that you can meet with 17 different organizations on the same day that have 150 people in 2 cities that can help them. They'll say, gosh, what took you so long? What took you so long? Because the person who needs help, and frankly, many people sitting in a corporate C-suite executive seat think that we already do this. They think we already collaborate. They think that, well, no, duh, of course you would do that. But we know that it's much more complex. If it was easy, we would have solved it by now. Just like if leaving an abusive situation was easy, we wouldn't have abuse. So just like a marathon, slow and steady strategy is really kind of the best. In my opinion, the best way to get there is kind of be in it for the long term. You got to be disciplined. You got to look at the goal that's really far ahead. So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and turn it back to you, Erica.
Thank you so much, Catherine. That was an excellent presentation. Thank you for bringing us home by giving us a local example too of the Family Justice Center and how it utilizes systems thinking approaches to promoting collaboration and better coordination for the work that we do. So thank you. And thank you for all of the presenters today. It was awesome how everyone's presentation really did complement one another, highlighted some of the same points and some of the questions that I even had as a moderator. So with our time remaining, we have just under 30 minutes. I just wanted to open it up for Q&A to make sure that we have some time for just conversations around the topics that were discussed today. So feel free at this moment to raise your hand and unmute yourselves to ask our panelists questions that you may have. And I will say too, while we have people kind of queuing up and thinking about what they're going to ask, there was something in the chat box around, can you maybe speak to different resources for fathers and men in regards to domestic violence and affordable housing, Catherine?
Yeah, and so, one of the things I didn't say, and I talk in terms of women and men, but about 25% of all clients who come to the Family Justice Center are men. So we work quite a bit with men. And I think that the access to, the sheltering systems, the emergency shelter, if we go back to that, a system of care for housing and violence and abuse, they've had to move in the past couple of years to allowing men into shelter, which is great because men are experience violence and abuse as well. So there are some shelter alternatives, and men can qualify for some of the, like, you get prioritization if you experience violence and abuse, and you can show that you can get prioritization in Section 8 housing and some other housing related vouchers. So it's not based on gender if you get access to those things.
Thank you, Catherine. And is it Lyndon? Lyndon has his hand raised.
Yeah, thank you. So I've got a question for James and Vincent, who presented earlier in the session. And say in Greensboro, I recently did a couple of gatherings with the two mayoral candidates, kind of open houses, and the conversations were really about the issues that you talked about. They were about zoning and housing, which are among the chief issues here in Greensboro. And some of the questions that I have here is that certainly, so the integration is going to reduce crime at large, but for the people who live in the more sheltered neighborhoods and upper income, the integration is probably going to increase the crime that they see, of course, in their neighborhoods, right? Well, there is general benefit. So are there models where people who are at the more privileged level of the spectrum can see positive benefits from integration, because there is resistance otherwise for making these changes?
I can just really briefly say, sorry, I know that you didn't ask me, but just, sorry, I was going to really quickly say that, there's tons of research out there showing that affordable housing, which is what we're saying, putting affordable housing in high opportunity neighborhoods, that it can lead to increased nearby property values. And so I was commissioned by the city of Alexandria, Virginia, to study the impact of our affordable housing on nearby property values, and actually found that they increase nearby property values. So I think this assumption that, a low-income person moving into my backyard, not in my backyard, is going to increase my crime, that's just a false assumption. And if anything, okay, maybe if there's like a short-term increase, the idea is that in the long run, that if we break down all these structural barriers that have led to these differences in crime by all of these, sorry, I'm not speaking very eloquently, but there's evidence to say that it can actually improve the property values of high income residents. And so I think we can use that as a tool. But even if there are some short-term negative impacts on people, we have to do it. I mean, we caused this in the first place. Like, our direct racist policy created the segregation and these racial inequities, and we have to fix it. So yeah, I'll let other people answer as well.
I just want to kind of push back and raise like a couple points, is that I think there's the need to kind of think about access, right? And access to resources and access to neighborhoods. And I think we often kind of like conflate that with a whole lot of things. And I think one of the important parts of our study is the investment in place, right? I think we've for far too long kind of emphasized policies that are around mobility, and particularly about moving poor people to higher income neighborhoods and placing the onus on them to be displaced from their settings, their networks, and everything else to other neighborhoods, right? And I think the real critical part of the conversation here is clearly thinking about the importance of neighborhood access to resources, access to kind of a broad set of things, and choice and agency in that. But I think the real power of investment in place and looking at disinvestment and how you actually make those neighborhood-based investments, so the premise isn't always that someone needs to move, that someone actually can still access those resources and those goods in their own neighborhood, because we actually believe in equitable investment structures, right? And to acknowledge that to do that, you have to be really intentional and to acknowledge the price implications of those kinds of investments. So it's not to negate the idea of promoting access to neighborhoods and the various positive things that can happen, but it is to kind of push back on the overemphasis that I think policy is often placed on that as being the solution, right?
Yeah, I don't know if I have much more to add. It's just part of it is that when you know our society gets so unequal that there are these neighborhoods that are so segregated, it's hard to solve things like on the back end, like, okay, we got to find a policy to do something about this that doesn't address income inequality at the aggregate level. But there's a lot of like interesting and kind of sad things about the disinvestment of community mechanisms to resolve crime and the fortification of really wealthy neighborhoods where, like you find in Detroit, for example, they have this private police force roving these really wealthy communities because they've bought, you know, they don't want to invest in policing. They want to invest in private policing. So they have their own like security force. So like there's like, I don't know if there's a perfect policy solution to like this idea of like protecting what I have. And, you know, I'm not sure.
And I'll just jump in too, because we had a similar question in the chat from Valerie, who, you know, kind of broadly just asked, how do we get people with different income levels to want to live together? So, you know, we're kind of talking about like policy is something that if it's a policy and it's enforced, that forces us maybe to make some changes that way. But generally speaking, how can we get folks to all want to live together harmoniously, right? Regardless of their income levels.
Take that really quickly or start on that one. So I don't think it's so much about getting people to want to live near each other. And we often actually talk about residential segregation, if it's by choice, is fine. It's when it's not by choice, that's a problem. And so I see it as not getting people to try to want to live near each other. If people want to live in enclaves of like people who speak their same language and are their same race and ethnicity, that's fine. But it's removing the exclusionary zoning policies and plans that don't allow people to move where they want to be or near opportunity. So that's how, yeah, I would see it.
That's great. And without the inequity, right? Anyone else had any other additional comments for Valerie? If not, we'll move to Wayne. I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'm Wayne Young, and I serve on the board for Habitat for Humanity here in Greensboro. And as first of all, I just think some of these ideas just need to be disseminated out to more of the public. It's really great stuff. My question is, we've been incentivized to invest in traditionally lower income neighborhoods. I just wonder, has anything ever been studied about incentivizing development, mixed development, so that more affluent are incentivized to move to, you know, say the east side of Greensboro, as opposed to trying to move people out of East Greensboro and you know, move to more affluent neighborhoods? It's kind of a weird reversal of fortune, but you know, I'm thinking about how difficult it's been to make the changes in just the inequities, and whatever way we can do it. I'm just thinking outside the box. Before I go, I would say I got a chance years ago through the Greensboro Leadership Greensboro program to visit the Family Justice Center, and they are doing amazing stuff down there. So thank you, Catherine, for all you're doing as well. So I'll just throw that out. What other interesting ideas have you all got? And anything you could offer to Habitat would be appreciated.
Thank you for that question, Wayne. Who would like to get the discussion going for us?
I can take a stab at just a part of what I would know on that. I mean, it's a good question about incentivizing higher income people to move into areas with lower income residents. I think more what occurs is targeted place-based investments like the ones that the other speakers spoke about as well. But so things like, you know, opportunity zones, which has a lot of its own challenges, you know, place-based investments through CDBG, new markets tax credit. I actually just did a big evaluation of the new markets tax credit program. My personal belief, and it's actually might be different than my colleagues who also spoke, is that, you know, these place-based investments, a lot of place-based investments end up just like kind of shuffling people around rather than really creating improvements to people's lives. So I personally prefer person-based investments or affordable housing investments. But I think they can work if they're done well. But I always argue, and we do a lot of work in transit as well, that if you are going to make place-based investments in transit or, you know, businesses, that you need to invest in preserving affordable housing in those areas so that people don't just get displaced. You know, if we look at the impact of new markets tax credit on the income of local residents, well, we have no idea whether that's just new higher income people moving in or people's lives are really being improved. So I think it's just an intricate web that you have to be careful with.
Yeah, I would just add to that, that I think part of it is like thinking about what the goal is, right? Of the policy intervention. And from what I hear, right, is just like, is again, going back to this idea of just investing in places that did not receive access to resources, right? Or don't traditionally receive access to resources. So is it just that you need people to move to that neighborhood, or you just need investment in that neighborhood, right? And so, you know, I think, you know, what Dr. Stacy was saying is really critical, though, is that unfortunately a lot of our place-based investment strategies don't think productively or proactive, I would say proactively, about larger issues of housing affordability, right? Because in many ways, what we've been reacting to is long-term systemic disinvestment in a broad set of neighborhoods. So any investment was considered a positive directional change, which could be true, right? But thinking about how to leverage that and ensure that it doesn't come at the cost of access is really critical, right? And I think it seems like in current narratives, that's very much at the core of a lot of conversations. And I think that's something we have to kind of increasingly think about as we promote these place-based investment models, acknowledging that that's critical, but also has broader implications for affordability of markets. And so how do we center that that concern in a way that promotes investment and leverages it, doesn't necessarily push it away, but also ensures that it doesn't result in displacement and lack of affordability in those areas.
Thank you so much for those comments. I know we have a question in the chat, but first I know Bernita's had her hand raised for a while. Would you like to ask your question?
Well, it's not really a question, it's more of a comment. And thank you all so much for all of this great conversation that we're having around housing. I really don't like the term affordable housing. I think we're working with housing that is affordable. And those are two different concepts, I believe, when it comes down to what we're trying to achieve in our community. But what I would say is that I believe that creating diverse communities is intentional, and it has to be very, very directed in how it's done. There are cities all across the country that have placed affordable housing in communities that were higher wealth communities, and no one even knew they were there. And so it becomes a part of the practice of a community to say to developers coming in that a certain percentage of the housing that you're creating has to be for individuals of low income or affordable housing to whatever is in that the median income is in that community. So I think it has to be a policy issue that we're working with, as opposed to saying, well, we wish and hope that this will happen. But as we continue to create affordable housing in certain areas, you're still creating pockets of what we just talked about through this whole discussion of like individuals living in a community that ends up the same way that we're talking about poverty that exists right now. So to me, it's an intentional process that communities have to work with. Public officials have to realize what happens when you create these communities and what the potential fallout and outcomes will be somewhere down the road. So I think it's a bigger discussion than just this. I think it's the political will of individuals who are elected to say, we're going to make this happen in our communities. And that's something they haven't been necessarily in favor of doing, because you look at developers and we don't really want to mess with those folks. But I think it's time for us to mess with those folks, because these housing communities that we see right now are not low wealth communities that we're building. And the average individual, even right now, can't afford to purchase in those areas. So we're still creating these pockets of poverty based on the current way that we do business. So again, I don't like the terminology affordable housing, because I don't think it really meets the standard of what we're trying to do. We need to have housing that is affordable, and there's a wide range of individuals looking for that, and it's not available in our communities. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments, Bernita. When we're talking about systems change, of course, it needs to be, that intentionality really needs to be there to see some systems level changes around this issue and others as well. Does anyone have any, an immediate response to what Bernita shared with us?
Hi, this is Sandra Boren with Cone Health Foundation. I appreciate what Ms. Sims had to say. I totally agree. And I guess the thing that concerns me even more is this perfect storm that's brewing with inflation. And it's not going to do anything except exacerbate the situation that we're in without some kind of policy intervention. And there's a lot of folks on this call that are more deeply steeped in policy than I am. But would you care to comment about what you see in terms of the effect of inflation on our current reality with housing?
That's a great question. Who would like to answer Sandra's question about inflation and how that impacts this topic?
Oh, I'm not an expert on that stuff, but I would say this. The crisis that we find ourselves is going to be further exacerbated by all of this that we're working with. When we start talking about living wages versus thriving wages, that becomes another whole conversation. So, when people think that when they start talking about $17, $19, $20 an hour, that this is going to make a dent in what we're working with, I don't think it will, because a family of three still cannot survive off of a $20 an hour job. It doesn't work unless you have those other supportive services that are available from other sources, such as social services and all of that. So at the end of the day, we've just created another bubble, I would say, of issues in our community. So even right now, we're seeing the results of what has happened with just COVID and coming out of COVID, where people are. Landlords don't want to rent. We have individuals out there right now with vouchers on the street that they can't use them. And they've been fervently looking, trying to find housing. And the landlords are saying, we're not taking these vouchers. So we have created a perfect storm as a result of what has happened with COVID, and it can only get worse. So at this point, some people's head, and I'm going to say electeds, heads are stuck in the sand around this whole issue of where we are. And so our homeless situation, and I think Dr. Sills would support this, our homeless situation is only going to get worse, because right now people can't find housing. It's not there. And landlords don't want to deal with certain renters because of what happened with Hope funding and all the rest of those CARES dollars that came into the community, and our inability to get it out to them in a timely fashion. So we've got a perfect storm. And the answer to that, I can't even begin to tell you what needs to happen to address that. When you have whole apartment communities that say, we're no longer going to take any type of subsidy in our community, that's huge. That is huge. And so these individuals, where do they go? What do they do? And how do we face this issue that we have? So I mean, I don't know. I wish I was, a genie in a bottle and I could create all this stuff instantly. It's not going to happen. But but we need to be talking about it in more than just these circles that we're in right now. Those folks that we have that have the ability to make the necessary systemic changes to fix this need to understand where we are and how quickly this needs to move. And it can't be, we're going to do this 5 years, 10 years, 15 years down the road. We have an immediate situation that we have going on. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of conversation taking place around it. There should have been news media and all those folk on this Zoom call that we're on right now that's writing this stuff down and reporting it out there so individuals understand where we are. So again, all of us on this call, we could probably come up with all the solutions in the world to kind of fix this, but it's going to take more than just us to make that happen.
I just want to, this is, Brittany, that, Ms. Sims, that is wonderful. I agree with everything you said there. And I just want to add a little bit to the inflation bit where I can't speak perfectly to it, but one of the things that's very clear is the cost of developing properties generally and rehabbing properties can be quite high already, right? And so in cities like Philadelphia with a high poverty rate, you essentially cannot develop affordable housing without a deep level of subsidy, right? So this isn't something that zoning on its own addresses, right? So zoning is a first wave as we think of kind of where you can build, right? But what you can build and making it affordable is intrinsically tied to a lot of things, one of it being land and another is the cost of construction. And so insofar as inflation takes hold and affects the cost of inputs and the timing of all the inputs, right, it makes it an even bigger challenge to making those development investment decisions, and particularly at price points that allow for affordable housing, right? And so that's a real kind of point of consideration always, regardless of inflation, but becomes even more real when you see prices potentially escalating as well.
To that one very practical solution that we're looking to. I'm on the board of our local affordable housing developer here in Alexandria, Virginia. And because of the cost of labor being very high in central cities, always, I mean, of course, now even more, and the lack of labor for construction, there's so much promise with prefabbed housing, and there is really good prefabbed multifamily housing now. So if you can use prefabbed multifamily housing in high labor cost areas, you're getting the labor from lower cost places and having that shipped and built directly. So there are very tangible solutions that could be being used. And I'll just say, Bernita, I love everything you said. And at Urban, we are really trying to push ourselves to be less of the people that do these 3-year-long research studies and put something out and maybe something happens from it. And we're turning more towards community engaged research and research working more like technical assistance. And so as an example of that, I'm working with the city of Rochester, New York and Memphis, Tennessee to do technical assistance around their use of spending of recovery funds, because cities are getting or about to get more money than they've ever seen. This is an amazing amount of money that's coming through. And there are very, very different ways that cities are choosing to spend it in differing ways, differing levels of community engagement that are involved in these decisions. And so we are trying to work in real time to produce evidence to help, and talking to leaders and talking with people to try to help make change there and help them find ways to spend the money. The way I always like to say to them is if you think about how much harm was caused by one policy, redlining, how many generations of an policy, think how much good we could do if we created that one policy or investment that did good for generations to come. And so using this opportunity, we're really trying to push ourselves to do that really hard, uncomfortable work of real-time research and evaluation to help with making change on the ground. But if you have suggestions for how to do that better, we're always all ears.
Thank you so much. I know we only have 5 minutes left, and this has really been an invigorating conversation, and the presentations I really appreciate it, and I'm sure those in the audience did as well. And I know we might have a few questions or comments in the chat that we won't be able to get to individually, but I'm hoping this last question that I'm going to pose to panelists can help round us out. So just think, if you were in the elevator and you had to give your elevator speech around this issue, what would be some of the main advocacy points you would recommend you would share with policymakers, elected officials, stakeholders, et cetera, about safe housing and violence prevention? If we could just have each of our presentations really quickly, 30 seconds or less of some words that we could share with our stakeholders about this topic. Who would like to go first?
I'll go first. I think a relationship-based experience. So can we tell the story of someone and a story of someone who lives in that person's neighborhood? Because I think we've separated these issues of it happens to someone else, not someone on my block. And these stories do exist. So I think a relationship-based story is the first step in kind of making that emotional connection to a much larger challenge.
Thank you, Catherine and Tina, because you're right beside me in my little box. What would be your elevator speech?
I'm trying to think of something new to say that I didn't already say, but I think I would just say, I mean, really acknowledging the intentional racist policies of our history. We need to make up for those decisions that led to the unequitable and neighborhoods that we see today that lead to, increased crime rates in neighborhoods with low incomes. And so I mean, I think the one I just said though is my favorite, which is like trying to be uplifting of, if we can do this right and we can fix this, think about all the good we could do for generations to come. And so even if there is a little bit of pain in the short run, it's going to be worth it in the long run. And it's not just to do good, it's an imperative because of what we have done in the past to get here.
Thank you, Dr. Stacy. Dr. Renna?
I mean, I think I would say we have to kind of view this as a multifaceted reality, right? That is rooted in a lot of structural inequities, that some of which are housing related, but a lot of which are not, right? And so I think we can clearly kind of make the case for housing-based investments and no one solution being the solution, but part of kind of like a broader suite of efforts. But I mean, I think the key aspects of what Ms. Johnson was talking about, the intersectionality of all of this, right, is really critical, and that's hard and it's complicated and it's a process. And it's a never-ending process in many ways, because it's antithesis to things like Yamahata Taylor said. We're not trying to promote predatory inclusion, right? We're trying to kind of reshape systems and promote a better future. And so I would tell them to go talk to Ms. Johnson and the people on the ground really doing that hard work to recognize and acknowledge that intersectionality in really meaningful ways.
Well said, thank you. And Dr. Tuttle?
Yeah, just going back to the focus of mine is that aggregate inequality has gotten worse and worse over the last 40 years. And to really deal with, like, it feels like a lot of times we're dealing with like all the consequences of it. And if you don't like actually root out or at least reduce some of that aggregate economic inequality, you're going to continue to have to put out these fires of like having segregated housing because some people have so much money to spend on it and other people have nothing to spend on it. So you have, to me, it's about the middle class and lower class having better economic opportunities, which isn't an easy like policy fix, but to me, that's the fundamental issue is income inequality keeps increasing.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you so much again for all of our presenters. Thank you for this conversation. I would just add, my main points would be to continue these conversations and engagement around this topic, because we need to have a more educated citizen base, residents who, and reading things like color of law, right? So we don't just think that people are choosing, people don't always have a choice. And what can we do from a systems thinking approach to addressing these issues simultaneously? First of all, we have to start with continuing conversations and moving towards action based upon those conversations that are representative and are inclusive, and making sure that everyone that needs to have a seat at the table is actually there to dine with us as we discuss. Dr. Stephen Seals, do you want to officially send us home at 2 p.m.?
Sure thing. I'm going to give a quick shameless plug there in the chat for a draft of a working paper called Enduring Impact of Racialized Planning in Southern Cities. Much like the Color of Law, this tracks the history from Reconstruction to present, looking at the many different time periods in which we've racialized geography of Southern cities in particular. And you'll see a lot of Greensboro in this paper. It came out of our work on redlining in Greensboro. Also give a plug for our website, drop that into the chat. as soon as we have a recording available, we'll get this up online. It'll be posted under the news items just below the lower bar of the screen. If you scroll up just a little bit, you'll see where we post new news items, and you'll see a link to this recording and information from each of the presenters. I want to thank Erica for doing a marvelous job, both as a facilitator and organizing this panel, as well as for her whole year here as a research fellow. We've really enjoyed having her and look forward to continuing to collaborate. Thank you to all of our panelists, and we hope to see you again at our next Housing Hangout in February. Look out for emails from us very shortly. See you all later.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Bye.